if you haven't joined us before, just want to introduce myself. I'm Catherine Pemberton. I'm director of the Powder Magazine. And this is part two of our Carolina, the first 50 years Zoom at Noon series that we're going to be doing for today and for the next couple weeks on Thursdays at noon. So welcome to everybody. One of the things that I wanted to do first before I introduce our really fabulous speaker is to just share the fact that there is some really fabulous programming going on right now, organized by our friend Sandy Slater, Dr. Sandy Slater at the College of Charleston through the Lowcountry Atlantic World program. And it's all about Indigenous voices. And Sandy's done a really fantastic job of pulling in a lot of the surrounding area, the groups, the Indigenous groups, and putting together, you can kind of see here, different programming. There's a lot of information on these two websites. I've put them in the chat so you can kind of get to these websites on your own, because it kind of fits in with what we're talking about today. But those websites are in the chats, and I really encourage you to start there. And what I think we'll do is, yes, also please, oops, sorry, I'm trying to do too many things at one time. Please, if you are a tour guide and you would like certification, continuing certification, education credits for this talk today, please put your name in the chat and we'll kind of go from there. So with that, at the end, I'll kind of go over that roll call, but yes, please put your name in the chat if you're looking for credits, and we'll kind of go from there. But in the meantime, I want to introduce our speaker, and Jon, you're cleared to share anytime. I think I've stopped sharing, so you can go ahead and share. I want to introduce you. If you don't know Jon Marcoux, he's a friend of mine, long time. And I hate it. He's moved out of the Charleston area, but he's gone out to great things. He is at the University of North Carolina. He's the director of the research labs in archaeology. He's chair of the archaeology curriculum, associate professor of the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology. Prior to that, he was here in Charleston as the director of the Clemson program in historic preservation, the master's programs. And that was something, he was fantastic for years and went through COVID and all that kind of stuff, and really beloved by our program. And we miss him, so we keep pulling him back. Before that, he was doing something similar as the director of their historic preservation program at Salve Regina in Newport, Rhode Island. But his real core focus area is archaeology, and that's something he's been able to get back to, which is really, really wonderful. And he is the expert to me, although he's saying, you know, I know we need to really defer to the Indigenous groups as the experts, but to me, he's the expert that I know about the early colonial landscape, especially as it pertains to Indigenous landscape. So we're really excited that he could talk to us today. And we have a big group. Again, if you just joined us and you need continuing education credits, please put your name in the chat, and also check out the websites for CLAW's Indigenous Voices programming. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jon and get him to tell you everything he knows in the next hour.
That actually won't take too long. I'm only kidding. Welcome everybody, and good afternoon, and thank you, Catherine, for that great introduction. The program at Clemson MSHP, the Master of Historic Preservation program, really is near and dear to my heart, and I don't think you'll ever able to get rid of me. It was 5 wonderful years, even if it included COVID among that. Speaking of which, The last time I gave a talk on this topic was literally, it was at the Charleston Museum about 2 or 3 days before the world got shut down. And I'll never forget that day. We might have been a super spreader event because it was a packed house, unfortunately. But this is a, I think it's a fascinating topic, and it's a very understudied topic, and I'm glad that Dr. Slater and Claw are doing programming around this very topic of Indigenous voices in the Low Country. And my talk today, I think, will hopefully get across this idea that was kind of put forth by the colonists. I think they wanted to erase the indigenous presence from the landscape, and it was pretty early on that we see evidence of this. And so archaeology, the excavation of sites and the investigation and analysis of material remains, of garbage, essentially, offers us a complementary line of evidence to create narratives and stories about what daily life was like. Unfortunately, the mentions of Indigenous communities in the historic record are kind of few and far between. They're usually heavily biased. They usually are in reference to things that were part of the colonial agenda, like land transactions, hostile sort of behaviors, open war, as you'll see in a second. And then quickly, the indigenous voices are sort of put in the background. There's a sort of myth that there's the extinction of these groups very early on in the 18th century, which, of course, we know, and let me see if I can get, there we go. We know that that is not the case, and that indigenous voices continue to survive and live their lives. And into this day, the descendants of the people whom I will talk about today are alive and well and living all across the state of South Carolina and likely elsewhere. This is a map showing the sort of governmentally recognized groups across South Carolina, which includes Indigenous groups that are recognized by the state of South Carolina, as well as South Carolina's only federally recognized Indigenous or American Indian group. And I don't have time to get into the distinctions between federal and state recognition. I will say that it involves just a process that these groups have to go through, and results in sort of support, at least at the federal level, with respect to healthcare, education, etc. But these are the groups whose voices continue to be heard through, I think, Dr. Slater's programming, through cultural events that they hold, and then through museum exhibits and interpretive exhibits that these groups are increasingly either doing themselves or in concert with museums across the Lowcountry. So I would encourage everyone to go to those. And I will also say very quickly, over the last 5 years or so, especially, there's been an increasing sort of transformation in academia to do collaborative work. And it's a great thing. And it's something that I know I'm pursuing in my career. And I really wish that I had that sort of collaboration in this. I do not wish and do not hope to speak for these indigenous groups. I'm introducing you to sort of their story with respect to archaeology, but it is their story. It's not mine, and I acknowledge that. So, so what you'll hear from me today, take into account that it's sort of interpreted through my lens. I'll also begin by saying that I'm an archaeologist. I'm not a historian, and historians have done a wonderful and impressive job at kind of collating the primary information we have on these indigenous groups into really compelling narratives about their history. In particular, we can see in this slide a number of sources that I would recommend folks engage with. They're ones that I engage with in writing and in creating this lecture. I'll just point out very quickly, there are primary documents. That's the original sort of correspondences that mention these groups. Eugene Waddell in 1980 created the book that you see in the upper left-hand corner, Indians of South Carolina Lowcountry. And that is an incredibly robust source of information. It's a bit clunky in that it's almost like an encyclopedia and less like a historical narrative, but it has easily the most information that I've seen. It's an impressive work. It's also available free in PDF if you Google Indians of South Carolina Lowcountry and Hathi Trust, HATHITRUST. You'll be able to access a PDF version of that. I'll also plug a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Nick Butler at the Charleston County Public Library. Nick has created an incredibly useful, entertaining, compelling podcast, The Charleston Time Machine. He literally covers like every topic you'd ever want to sort of to engage with when it comes to Charleston and the Low Country, and he has a podcast on our topic, on the topic that we're talking about today. He had another one about the removal of the Etowah Indians from the peninsula prior to the establishment of the sort of urban center of Charleston. Both of those are excellent podcasts, and they also the website for that has the sort of script. So it's both a text resource as well as an entertaining listen. He's got a dulcet voice, which is very nice, and he takes his podcasting very seriously. It's a very high quality podcast. And then lastly, the Shaftesbury Papers, South Carolina Historical Society. These are the correspondences, many of the correspondences from between Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury. Lord Ashley has a well-known plantation that he established northwest of the original Charleston settlement. And so he, through corresponding with the governor, and he was also a Lord Proprietor, so there's lots of information going back and forth across the Atlantic, and those all exist and are readable in the Shaftesbury Papers. And lastly is the Grim Years, the book that I believe y'all will be hearing more about later this week. That is probably the most recent history that I'm aware of anyway, of what the sort of topic that we're talking about. So all of these sources I think are great. They're wonderful. So when I first sort of thought about this idea of, you know, what was life like for indigenous communities, American Indian communities, right when the colony was begun, I remembered that a couple years ago I had written a book review of this book called The First Manhattans, A History of the Indians of Greater New York by a long time serving National Park Service historian named Robert Grummet. And in this book, his premise is pretty interesting. He begins his book with a really famous, you know, historical trope, right, of the selling of Manhattan in 1626. I'm sure it's a moment that we all learned in grade school. Usually, it goes something like the Indians sold the land, the entire island, for $24 in trinkets, you know, and beads and bells and things like that. And you know, for many years it served as a sort of a racist trope for the naivete of Native Americans, or you know, this idea of that indigenous communities had no sense of ownership, and everyone owned the land. And Grummet really, he rightfully explains that that is such a naive take on what happened. It's not a matter of swindling, or it's not a matter of being taken advantage of. He posits that indigenous groups and Europeans had very different concepts about land and about ownership and about the tie of people to the land. And his argument was that you can see through deeds, and the book is essentially tracing a number of land sales, hundreds of land sales. It's a painstaking history that he undergoes, but he shows how in the European mind, right, we're probably more familiar with this, is that land to us is a bounded entity, and it's something that we own, and when we sell it we give up our rights to it, and that's sort of it, right? And there's a transactional relationship. So in this Manhattan moment, um, Peter Minuet is sort of, he's enacting that European style. I will give you X, and I'll give you these things, and you will give me ownership of the land, and you will leave. And Grummet's argument is that with Native Americans, the act of gift giving is actually not a transaction that ends relationships. It's actually a transaction that begins relationships. And that it's not about land ownership, it's about use rights. It's not about owning the land physically and binding it, it's about access to resources. And what he shows through his historical analysis is, for decades and decades after Indian communities sell their land, they're still showing up in the historic record to come back and to access the resources that their ancestors sort of developed many, many years ago. And he said that a lot of the frustration and a lot of the violence that ends up happening between European settlers and Native American communities comes out of that misunderstanding, where again, from a Native American perspective, the sort of interaction, the transaction, if you will, of gift giving, it's an establishment of an enduring relationship that has to do with use rights, et cetera. But for Europeans, it was very much a terminal thing. We will give you this, and then we don't want you on our land anymore. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the early interaction of Native American communities here in Charleston with the initial settlers and settlement, you see a similar pattern develop. And I imagine it probably is something that you see time and time again. This is an image of the deed of sale, I guess you could call it, that involved Lord Ashley's plantation in 1675. This is out of Bates and Leland's book on proprietary records. And you can see here the language that's used in the deed, and it sort of suggests that sort of, that interpretation that I had here, where it talks about, it sort of lays out, it says, know ye that we caciques, those are the chiefs of the various communities, heirs and sole owners and proprietors of, and it lists sort of the boundaries of that area. We hereby we sell, grant, and forever quit and resign the whole parcel. So it's very sort of explicit in the deed. One wonders, was that actually conveyed to the folks that were signing this? Was that conveyed to the indigenous communities? Again, this was a very foreign concept. This was something that didn't happen between indigenous groups. But we see that sort of reading, right? The Europeans are engaged in this process with a very specific outcome. We wonder if that's actually being interpreted the other way. And what we'll see is a series of, in the very first year or two of the settlement, some sort of trauma that comes out of what potentially is that misunderstanding. So the landscape in which the Carolina colony was founded uh, was very diverse in terms of the number of indigenous communities that existed. I will say, however, the population densities do not appear to be super high, and we'll get to that, estimates of what those populations were in a second. But what we see are, and this is a map from Waddell's book, there are about 18 different groups mentioned between the Spanish documents of the late 16th century and the English documents of all the way up to the mid 18th century. And these groups are sort of distributed all the way from the Savannah River all the way up to the Santee, and of course beyond. But these are the groups that are most heavily referenced with respect to Charleston's colonial record. Nick Butler, in his podcast, put together a great table here that he pulls out of Waddell, talking about each of these groups. So you can see here a list of, I believe there's 18 individual groups. It also lists the first date in which they're mentioned in colonial records, as well as the last time that they're mentioned. And then it refers to specific pages within Waddell. So if you really are interested in this, it's really neat to have this table up and have Waddell's book, and you can really delve into the details. Waddell actually, at the end of his book, breaks down each group and talks about all the times they're mentioned, along with an annotation about what that mention is. Again, it's an incredible resource. What you'll see here is that the last mention of most of these groups is in the mid 18th century. So what tends to happen is very early on, we see individual groups mentioned, especially in these land transactions. But increasingly, the term settlement Indians is used as a gloss for all indigenous people, regardless of what group they come from. And again, Waddell identifies the potential, lots of potential diversity in terms of the cultural identities of these groups with respect to the languages that they spoke, with respect to other cultural practices. And I wonder, and are these actually groups, or what we find out later among cultural groups like the Catawba, the Cherokees, and the Creeks is that folks reckon their identity with towns or villages. So potentially, rather than sort of discrete cultural, groups like the Creeks, the Cherokees, and the Catawbas, these names might reference, much smaller sort of aggregates like settlements or towns. But this is the research that needs to be and continues to be done. So we can chart the sort of relationship that sort of begins on a high note, let's say. Again, this is a pretty common narrative in colonial sort of history, right? That when the Europeans show up, the indigenous communities begin sort of a friendship. There is usually some sort of commerce between the two. The indigenous communities usually help the European colonists get through a number of crises, and then relatively quickly relationships sour, and we start to see trauma and violence come out of that. So with respect to this particular instance, the initial landing of the colonists to form the Charlestown colony, they kind of get split up, and two ships end up around Bulls Bay and the other one sort of down south near Port Royal. And they initially had planned on setting up their colony at Port Royal. They bump into a leader, a cacique of the Kiowa Indians, who encouraged the group to settle where they ended up settling, where today the Charlestown Landing historic site is. So this notion of inviting, saying, "Hey, come here, you can settle on our land." Again, this is a sort of certainly, and this invitation is a friendly gesture, but there may have also been some strategy behind it, because at the same time, the Kiowa Indians were suffering from sort of violent raids from Indian groups that had come into the region from elsewhere. And this group is known as the Westo Indians. Some archaeologists and ethnohistorians believe that the Westos are initially a group from the Great Lakes area, the Erie, related to the Erie Indian Nation, that were pushed out of their land during the wars between the Iroquois and the Huron, and that those groups migrated down the Appalachian Mountains and essentially survived by enslaving groups that they were living near, and selling them to English traders. And the Westos were sort of well known at this time in the mid 17th century for attacking the coastal indigenous communities from Charleston all the way down the Savannah River. So there was that, and we see at the bottom of this slide there's a relation, a communication between Carteret and about what was happening in this area in the Westo raids. And then the passage up above that image there is talking about how the local indigenous communities were trading with and helping the settlers at the founding of the Charleston colony. A little bit later, but within months, we see another. This is a letter from William Owen to Lord Ashley Cooper, talking about when there was a purported attempted raid by the Spaniards and allied Indians coming up from St. Augustine where they sort of camped outside and never ended up actually attacking. But he's talking to Lord Ashley about the indigenous communities that would have come to the aid of the settlers. And in and among those groups, he talks about the Wando, the Etowah, the Siwi, the Sehi, and then says that they could have mustered 1,000 fighters, people who would fight on their behalf. So you get the sense that there's a genuine sort of allyship that's happening here. And then not too much later, we start to see the sort of hints or more explicit mentions that things are not sort of as great as initially sort of laid out. And you can see in this historical excerpt of the governor writing to the council back in England, talking about the exploits of the Cusco Indians, saying that they were basically stealing corn, that they were threatening people, that they were coming into their property, their plantations in the nighttime, etc. And then sort of implying or explicitly stating that they were conspiring with the Spanish. And so sort of declaring open war will be prosecuted against this group. Again, if we think back to Grummet's argument about indigenous views of land use, this idea that the Indians are using or coming across their plantations, one can understand how that might be interpreted as a misunderstanding where indigenous groups still thought and perhaps had thought they had rights to go across that land, and how that was interpreted as an incursion by the folks from Europe who have very distinct views about land, property boundaries and private ownership of land. And so this notion of open war, don't think, big amassed armies or anything. This was, small bands of militia who were probably raiding Indian communities nearby and capturing folks and likely in selling them into slavery. Shortly after that initial correspondence, we then see this statement that's talking about the payment of tribute, I guess you could say, but it's a performative gesture. So it says the Cuscos to pay a deerskin monthly in acknowledgement or else lose our amity, right? Our friendship. And so I think this can be interpreted as sort of it's a putting a group under your thumb, essentially, of making them sort of admit fealty or defeat by providing this deer skin as a sign of a lesser standing, I guess you could say. And then in 1674, you see the governor basically talking again back to England, saying that there has been this violent encounter where Cusco Indians have murdered 3 Englishmen. And so the governor is saying that they are going to raise a party and use all means to destroy all or any of them. So again, we have here the reaction of the colonial government or colonial militia to, in this case, prosecute violence against this group. The image I have here, by the way, is an image associated with the Yamasee War, which happens, some 40 years later or something. I would say, though, if you look at there just aren't images from this time period. That's why I'm using this. But if you look at the build up to that violent encounter in 1715, I think you'll see very similar things happening. You'll see encroachment of what the colonists consider their property. You'll see what again is called the stealing or the killing of cattle by the Yamasee Indians, etc. And there's the same sort of result, which is a violent clash. So after that initial sort of what sort of is called the Cusco War, which again, war is kind of a relative term, but a violent incursion against indigenous groups whom the colonists are saying are stealing things, in this case, are doling out violence, are encroaching upon their land, etc. We then start to see more and more the sort of cession of land by these indigenous groups. So when you see them mentioned in historic records, it's because it is through a deed, basically, or it's a statement of one of these violent incursions. And so we see about 5 years after that Cusco War, Maurice Matthews is describing the Oyster Point or the peninsula of Charleston, and then describing the area around that. And when he gets to the northwest of Charleston along the Wando River, he provides this description where he says, "The rest of the land is allowed to our Indian neighbors, for we thought it not justice, through our own consent and with valuable consideration, paid them to remove them from their old habitations, and then paid for them and provided them a secure place to plant and live comfortably." So again, that sort of European notion of removing folks, of having a transaction of some sort. In this case, they are bragging, or at least saying we paid them a considerable amount, and then removed them and gave them this land where they can live in security. And we'll see in a second, on a larger map, where those folks are being moved to. So just like what happens much later in our history, you'll start to see indigenous communities being marginalized, right, or moved to the edges of the core of colonial settlement. One of the largest cessions of land by indigenous communities happens around 1684 and 85, where a number of groups are documented as giving up their land, and this account here describes the area that's being ceded. And I have a map here from 1685 as just sort of a reference. So the area that this land cession entails begins, it's bounded by the east by the sea, so it goes all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It's bounded to the north, it says northwest, but they likely meant northeast, by the Stono River, which is the Stono River of today, and also what it says by other lands. So it's lands that are already owned or inhabited by the English. And then the interesting part is it says it's bounded on the west by a great ridge of mountains commonly called the Appalachian or Appalachian Mountains. So the cession of these groups that live along the coast goes all the way to the Appalachian Mountains, and then south to the Westo River, which I believe is probably the Savannah River. And then it lists the caciques or captains or chiefs, meaning the leaders of those groups. And that includes the Cusco, the Stono, the Edisto, the Ashapu, the Combahee, the Coosa, the St. Helena, and the Wimby. So in one sort of fail swoop, the English are saying that these groups are ceding land that goes all the way west to the Appalachians and all the way down to the Savannah River. So again, one has to wonder, well, why would those groups do that? What would be the indigenous perspective on what this land cession, quote unquote, might have been? The result, though, is a land cession in terms of where these groups were living. They were marginalized. And we can see the perspective of this new landscape that emerges. It's only about 10 years, 15 years after the founding of the Carolina colony in 1670. We go from a landscape that's relatively sparsely populated. It's not super densely populated by indigenous communities, but they're laid out from the Savannah River all the way up to the Santee. But by 1685, less than a generation, a half a generation, we see that the landscape has been transformed, especially when we look at it through the English perspective, which is through maps. So we start looking at these maps, and what you'll see is what you'll see right here. So this is the Edward Crisp map, which was drafted in 1711, but a lot of what we'll see here is based on information that Maurice Matthews collected in 1685, which was that map that I just showed. So I'm going to zoom in on a few different areas here. So this area shows, I don't know if y'all can see my cursor, but this is the Charleston Peninsula. And if you sort of look closely, Charleston itself at the time was a walled city. So we see our walled city here. All of these names are private owners of English plantations. So again, within 15 years of the founding of the original Charlestown settlement, we now see dozens of individual plantations all up and down the peninsula, up and down the Ashley, the Cooper, and the Wando River. And where we see the names of indigenous communities, they are at the edges, right? At the boundary between, the colonial world and what's beyond the colonial world from a European perspective. This is that area that Maurice Matthews says we colonists set the Indians there so that they can plant in peace. Sort of, they deigned it. Again, it's a statement of power as well. And here we see the notations for the Sampa Indians, the Wando Indians, and then the Siwi Indians, who interestingly show up a number of times, including in John Lawson's travel narrative at the turn of the 18th century. But that's another story. There's a very interesting story in there about the Siwi Indians getting into a canoe to sail to England to complain to the king. So I encourage you read John Lawson's narrative as well. But here we see again, push to the edges. If we shift to the west and sort of south of Charleston, so this is down near New London, which is now known as Willtown. This is sort of the Hollywood area. We see an indication of, here's Edisto Island, obviously. We see an indication of an old Crusoe settlements. So again, pushed in this case to the west. The Crusoe were thought to be a group, or are thought to be a group, who was living where St. Giles is, where Lord Ashley's plantation was, which was on the Ashley River. And now here we see in 1685, these folks are living a good deal west of where they were living in just 10 years earlier. And then as we go to south in sort of the Edisto Johns Island area, we see three indications of indigenous settlements. In this case, two of the three don't even have particular names associated with them. It just simply says Indian settlements, one on the west side of Bohicket Creek, and then two down near the mouth of Bohicket Creek and the Edisto River, and the Kiowa Island. And so many folks think that Kiowa Indian settlements, the Kiowa were the folks that were inhabiting where Charlestown Landing Historic Site was, that they were sort of pushed down or chose to leave or fled south to the Kiowa River. So that's in 1685. By 1710, you basically have the English trying to ramp up more colonists to come to Carolina. There are the publishing of these pamphlets, like this one from Thomas Nairn, that basically described the area and also kind of encouraged folks to move here. And Thomas Nairn in that has a statement talking about the control that the English have garnered over this area with relation to indigenous communities. And he basically says what is more considerable by drawing over to our side, so by allying with or destroying all Indians within 700 miles of town, they're basically not afraid of invasion from Spain or from any hostile group, and the colonists should feel safe. Thomas Nairn would regret those words in 1715 during the Yamasee War, where he was tortured and killed. But he was pretty brave in writing this, pretty confident that things would be great, and they weren't for him. So by 1715, when the Yamasee War breaks out, again, looking from the European perspective, the colonists had already sort of engaged with this idea that any indigenous folks around Charleston are negligible, that they're gone, that they're either they call them settlement Indians, or that they've been sort of absorbed into, in some cases, the enslaved populations, or they've moved away. They've been adopted or moved into other indigenous communities, or perhaps they're living in places that aren't easily accessible by Europeans. And again, we see that narrative sort of materialized in these maps. maps. So this is the Barnwell map printed in 1721, but based on information from 1715. And what you'll notice is the scale. So this is a map that includes information all the way from the eastern seaboard, from Charleston, all the way to the Mississippi River. So the sort of gaze of the colonists they were already thinking about groups, about the landscape hundreds and hundreds of miles inland. This is when the deerskin trade and the trade in indigenous slaves is really ramped up. And so the information or the attention that colonists have at this time is much further afield. And if we zoom, you can't see it, I'm sure, but all of that writing in there, especially as you move west, that's all in relation to indigenous communities inhabiting those areas who were at the time both the trading partners and the sort of military allies. When we zoom in locally to Charleston, we see no sort of indication of indigenous communities being left. We know this is not because indigenous people weren't living there or around. It's because, again, the narrative that was being sort of promulgated by the colonists was that they were gone. So what you see here instead are indications of what I call like a landscape of memory. So the indigenous folks are remembered, and in this case, the indications are not good. These are three locations of battles that were associated with the Yamasee War in this map, where George Chicken defeated a group of indigenous warriors at the ponds. And then there were two other battles that at the beginning of the Yamasee War. But you won't see, if you kind of zoom in there, and I've looked, you won't see any indication of indigenous communities like you saw in that 1685 map. So from the perspective of the colonists, the indigenous communities are remembered, but they're remembered because they no longer exist. And again, as we know from today, the descendants of those people are still there. So the interesting thing, and you know, I'll get to it a little bit later, is as scholars, as folks who are working collaboratively with descendant groups, the story of what happened from that moment in 1715 until now is really the cool story. And that's the one that I hope we can continue to work on. But I'm here to talk a little bit more about what archaeologists can say about what life was like in these communities during that initial period that I've just described. So when the colonists arrived, what was life like in these communities? And I always think when I sort of come to this question of a neat book. People can argue with the sort of scholarship, but I think it's a neat read, and I would recommend it. The book 1491 that sort of talks about indigenous communities here before the arrival of Columbus. So, what was life like in 1491? I'm going to do something similar with the groups here. So, in terms of population, as I mentioned before, all indications we have, both archaeologically, which I'll show in a minute, and ethnohistorically, is that this area was not super densely populated in the mid 17th century. And even in the 16th century, the Spanish accounts that we have indicate relatively low population densities. So the list that you see there is one that Waddell cites from a census that was taken in 1682. So during that initial kind of period of removal, violence, depopulation. So this was the population of 5 indigenous communities: the Cusco, Edisto, Stono, and Etowah. And it's given in terms of bowmen. So again, the English are concerned with the fighting power of these communities, both as allies, but probably as potential threats as well. And that number in 1682, Waddell estimates, basing if there's, a bowman is likely a male, he likely has a partner and they have children. He estimated about 650 indigenous people across those 5 communities. Likewise, he kind of goes back in time and uses Spanish accounts to estimate the population of the region in 1550. So this was, during the time when Spanish first set up their colonial settlements, and he estimates the population to be over twice that amount, but still 1750 is not, a huge, densely occupied area when you compare these numbers to groups further inland, let's say, like in the Tennessee River Valley, in the Savannah River Valley, etc. So archaeologically, I can say that the communities that live during this period, we do not have a huge corpus of data about. We do not have tons of sites, and partly this is because population densities were not very high. The other thing is that the I would say virtually all the information we have is due to archaeology associated with development. So when development happens, archaeology typically has to be done. It's regulated by, or it's sort of mandated by law. And the sites that I'm creating this narrative about were all, except for Charlestown Landing, were all, and actually Charlestown Landing sort of was too, because they found it when they were building that original museum in the 60s. It was all related to that. So it's not really an academic oriented project. It's being found because stuff is being destroyed. And so archaeology happens to salvage that information before those places are destroyed. So I count here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sites. And again, when we compare the 8 sites that date, so this is, from at least what I know of, this is about all the sites that we know of that date to this period from 1550 to about 1700. If we look at the distribution of sites that date to the previous period, what's known as the Mississippian period, which predates European arrival by about 100 years, we see that there's a fair number of more sites. Still, though, it's not super densely occupied. We compare this to the preceding period, what's known as the woodland period, we see there's a lot more sites. And part of this has to do with the way people are living during the woodland period. So over 1,000 years ago, folks were moving around the landscape a lot. And so as they moved around, they're leaving traces. So it might look like there's more sites when really it might look like there's more people, but there really isn't. Versus the Mississippian period where folks are living a little bit more sedentary. They're planting fields, etc. However, we know from European descriptions that of explorers that are sort of coming up and down the coast that the Mississippian societies seem to be relatively mobile as well. They're not living in towns for generation after generation. They're maybe moving seasonally or at least every few years. And there's been some speculation. There's a neat book called The Mega Drought that talks about why there might have been a precipitous drop in population here between about 1,000, the end of what's known as the Mississippian period, so right around 1425. And then when we see the arrival of the Europeans in the area in the next century, there's an archaeologist, John Cable, who looks at precipitation data and finds evidence of a widespread drought that may have caused folks to leave this area and then start trickling back. That's another talk. So when we look at, I can sort of trace out this picture by comparing what we know archaeologically about what these settlements are like and what evidence there is of their lives to what came before. So I'll compare what I call the Ashley period, which is the period of time right when the Europeans arrived, to what it was like prior to when the Europeans arrived. So this is probably one of the best known and reported sites that dates to this period. And it's a site that was found on Daniel Island during a project that predated the development of that island. And what you'll see by looking here is it is essentially these little dots are where wooden posts were in the ground, and then the larger circles are where there were pits in the ground where garbage was. And so this location had the remnants of 3 or 4 buildings and maybe a dozen features. So right off the bat, we see, it's and also it's just a single household. So we don't really find evidence of what we might call villages. Maybe there was another 5 or 6 households at the site, but it's not like what you would think of when you think of a town. It's definitely probably a couple dozen people living here. Compare that site. So this is about 25 meters across. So you figure it's about 100 feet across by 100 feet. Not super big. This is a zoomed out map showing the size of archaeological sites that date to the preceding Mississippian period. So these are sites that I helped to delineate to figure out how big they are up on the Francis Marion, and these date to that Mississippian period. And for instance, this 138CH51 is over 300 meters. So, that's almost 1,000 feet long, right? By, some hundreds of feet wide. And here's another one here, 1450, 38CH 1450 is almost as wide as it is long. So these are very large villages. Unfortunately, we have not had a chance to excavate these sites to see what it sort of looked like. We've only dug small tests to see how large they are. But I can say that the deposits at these sites are relatively intense. So the garbage, the amount of debris that's been adding up is significant. So that both means that they were probably inhabited for a long time, and they were inhabited by a lot of people. So there's a difference there between the sort of societies that were there 100 years before Europeans arrived, and then the kinds of societies that were there at around the time that the Europeans arrived. Another place or site where excavations have been conducted that have exposed what the town may have looked like happened at Charlestown Landing. So when they were excavating, when they were going to build the museum in the 1960s there, the archaeologist Stanley South uncovered this palisaded, what's called a ceremonial center that had a number of indications of architectural buildings. There were interments, human interments or burials located there. This is just a zoomed in picture showing these things that he interprets as ceremonial sheds and temples. My point here is not the particular interpretation of these, but if you look at the intensity of the features, right? The numbers of the little posts, the numbers of the pits. This was a site that was either lived for a long time or intensively lived. It's very similar to the kinds of sites that we see inland. So this is Town Creek in Mount Gilead, North Carolina, sort of southern part of North Carolina. There's very strong indications stylistically in pottery, et cetera, that these might have been culturally related. But that site that's at Charlestown Landing is very similar to the sites, the towns that were inhabited by indigenous groups inland for hundreds of years. And so, again, something happened between the 1300s and the 1600s that resulted in a shift in the way people were building their communities. They were living in smaller communities, certainly. And when we look at the actual like architecture and the intensity of occupation, again, that one farmstead that we know of in Daniel Island that dates to that period, right, when Charlestown Landing's founded, there's the evidence of like 3 structures, and they're relatively lightly built. They're not intense with big posts. They're relatively small. And we don't see a lot of evidence that they're being rebuilt or being repaired and lived in for a long period of time. We can contrast that and also the garbage, the sort of what were pit features. These were sort of things that were dug in the ground, probably to store food or maybe to cook food. And then after they were used, they were filled with trash. And that's where we get most of our information from. So here we see 4 of these pits that were located around that house. In total, there was about a dozen. And then these are the buildings. You can see here they put little pie plates or little paper plates around where the posts were. So we can see a square building, a rectangular building, a little small round building that may have been like a corn crib. Compare this, and this is probably what it looked like. These are reconstructed buildings at DeSoto National Park. Compare this to the way Mississippian houses were built. So these are indigenous groups that, again, lived about 100 years before European colonial contact. What we see is tons of those posts. And it's not because the house itself was built with that many posts. It's because the house, as time goes on and posts rot, they have to rebuild the houses. But folks stayed in the same place multiple generations. And so what ends up happening is as they rebuilt the house, they would shift it slightly. And through time, it builds up what's called a palimpsest of posts of just overlapping posts. So not only are the towns not as large, when people are building their houses, they're building them more lightly and they're not living in that space for very long. They're becoming much more mobile. So this is an artistic representation of what one of those houses from the preceding period would look like. I had my son, I forgot about this slide. My son, John, I helped him. I probably micromanaged him, build a replica of one of these houses for his school. And I'm not sure why his face is painted. I'm sure we went to a museum or something like that. This would have been in 2020. I think we still have that diorama, by the way. I'm pretty proud of it. Although he built it. So when we look at the artifacts that come from these sites, one of the things I look at is pottery. And the pottery is very distinct from the period when Europeans arrived. We call it Ashley period pottery. It's largely decorated by a carved wooden paddle that's impressed in the side of the vessel in intricate designs. They also would incise or sort of carve lines with a pointed stick or stylus. These are just pictures of pottery that was recovered from that Daniel Island site. You'll see the sort of designs. And that's actually and these are the vessel forms of the shapes of the pots that indigenous groups are making at the time. During the preceding period, it's not much different. The pottery is pretty similar. We see a little bit different types of decorations around the rim. The motifs of the paddle decoration change a little bit, but overall they're pretty similar. And part of that is because it's part of a long-standing sort of cultural tradition. So archaeological sites all in this area that you see in this map, you find pottery that's decorated the same way. And we believe that this is sort of an overarching cultural practice that indigenous groups were practicing. This is how they made pottery. And it suggests a fair amount of continuity through time and also connectivity between groups that expresses itself as this regional potting style. In terms of food, what we see in both periods are that these groups relied heavily on domesticated cultigen of corn. So you find evidence of corn. Here we see a corn cob. You also see evidence of wild plants that are being gathered in the local area. And those include grasses that have seeds that can be ground and eaten they have high fat content. And those include something called little barley and maygrass. There's also been tobacco seeds recovered from Ashley sites, especially that one on Daniel Island. There's also other seedy plants that are in the amaranth family. So think like quinoa. They were eating that. They were also eating fruits like maypops that are naturally occurring in the area. They often, it's interesting to note that maypops often co-occur at the edges of cornfields. So a lot of times they're probably growing corn, but also harvesting these wild plants. And we find lots of acorns at these sites as well. When we move into the Ashley period, though, we find some things that aren't around before Europeans come because Europeans actually bring them here. The most common thing that we find are cultigen is the peach, so peach pit. Also cowpeas. Cowpeas did not exist here. In terms of animals that were in their diet, deer, turkey, turtles, raccoons, possum, we find all of these at both period sites, as well as aquatic resources, clams, oysters, a variety of different kinds of fish. And then, of course, again, when the Europeans come, they introduce new types of animals, in this case pig and cow, we do find at these sites. So just to wrap up, I just want to talk about sort of what's ongoing now, because again, the narrative that the indigenous groups disappeared, by the mid 18th century, we all know that that's hogwash, and that indigenous groups are still here. And it's their narrative, and that we should continue and sort of supply whatever skill sets we have as scholars, like as an archaeologist, to help them create and maintain their narratives. And we see examples of this now. The CLAW program's a great example. My colleague Carolyn Dillion up at Coastal Carolina has a long history of working with the Waccamaw Indian people, and they've been creating exhibits that are in the Horry County Museum. Recently, there was a story about the Edisto Natchez Cusco tribe applying for federal recognition, and I know there's a professor at the College of Charleston who's working with them on genealogies. So working on that aspect. I'm also, as sort of an archaeology nerd, I look at artifacts. So I'm looking at colonialware, which is a term we use to describe pottery that's made by indigenous and enslaved African people during the period of colonialism. And so I look at it as an example of the culture that emerges when Europeans brought enslaved Africans here, when indigenous people, either by choice or by enslavement, were living on these settlements. What happened to the way that they sort of made pottery. And so we find really evidence that sort of speaks to colonialism in general. For instance, I found pottery at the Lord Ashley site right around Charleston that was likely made by a group of indigenous people whose ancestors probably came from way up north in the Illinois area. These are known as the Savannah Indians, who had villages near modern day Augusta, Georgia. They're kind of like the Westos, who I mentioned earlier, and they were trading with Lord Ashley's folks at Lord Ashley's plantation. We've also found really interesting evidence of a tie to Africa on some plantations. So we found pottery at Drayton Hall and at the Hayward Washington House, but also in some other contexts that has evidence of what's called rouletting, which is the decoration style by you braid a piece of vegetable matter like a palmetto frond and you roll it over the surface. And we know that those have links to places in West and Central Africa. So these are sort of all to say that, as I said at the beginning of the talk, that sort of early period is interesting, and we need to continue researching that. But the period after that sort of notion, where the indigenous groups are gone from the historic record, that's the period I think that holds the greatest interest, and also has sort of the greatest impact on thinking about how important the history of the Low Country is how can we add to that already known narrative with history by bringing in things like oral history from descendant groups and things like archaeological information. So with that, I will shut up now. I've talked too long and I apologize.
You are absolutely fine. That was absolutely brilliant. Jon, very much appreciated. We did have some questions and comments for you. And that's a great series of acknowledgments. I will say, it strikes me that when Jon's talking about Charlestown Landing, next week we are going to hear from Nicole Eisenberger, who I think it might be on this call, on this Zoom. She is the archaeologist at Charlestown Landing, and she's going to talk about a lot of the recent work that's been going out there. But it is such a really incredible archaeological story at Charlestown Landing. I encourage you to visit and come next week as well. I'm going to do a quick roll call and let me know if I don't have you down. But for tour guides that I have seen that want continuing education credit, Abby Sutton, Don Grobel, Gloria Bailey, Jack Bowman, Julia Fox, Lacey Reinhart, Jenny Turner, I think is a guide as well. Skip Evans, Wade Lucas. So if there's anybody else, let me know in the chat. I did have one question in the chat, and I think it's probably been answered as you were talking. Somebody was asking about how best to get to get a hold of Gene Waddell's book. And Virginia
Yes,
told us,
it's half the, if you Google the name, and hang on, if I don't have access to it right now, but Hathy Trust, so it's HATHITRUST, Hathy Trust. They're kind of like on archive.org, and they're a repository for public access to books. And so Waddell's book is available through that. It's a PDF.
Great.
And the book title is, I'm going back to the slide. You'd think I would know it by heart by now. It's called The Indians of the South Carolina Lowcountry. So if you Google the Indians of South Carolina Lowcountry Hathy Trust, the link should come up.
Cool. Well, and I think Virginia says too, there's a link to Gene Waddell's papers at South Carolina Historical Society as
Yep.
well. Um,
And College of Charleston used to host it as well.
and I think I've seen that work on the shelf, I think at South Carolina Room at the Charleston County Public
It is.
Library as well. So
Yep.
hopefully lots of places to find it. It's really awesome. And Gene Waddell is a really incredible researcher. Another question that we have, and listen, y'all, if you have to peel off, please do. I know we're smushing this in a lunchtime, but for those of you who want to stick around, please do. Amanda from the Citadel, professor at Citadel, Michelle asks, are there languages spoken by pre-contact Carolinians still spoken or being preserved today beyond Cherokee and Catawba?
That's one of the things that I know was of interest to the sort of earlier researchers was the cultural identities of these groups. And there were suggestions just based on the names of these groups and the place names that both Muskogee and Siouan languages may have been spoken. So the Catawba speak a dialect of Siouan. The Muskogee languages would be the languages that Creek Indian groups spoke. In terms of the language, sort of, are they still spoken? Some of the groups may still, and it's just not being shared with folks who aren't in those groups. My sense is that, as a full-blown language, probably not. It doesn't mean that those languages can't be revived, that we have evidence of that or examples of that all throughout, New England and the East Coast, I'm sure the West Coast as well. Some of the early 20th century anthropologists collected a lot of information, and linguists can sort of help reconstruct language rules, etc. So it'd be interesting if some groups do that.
So interesting. Well, one thing that I had a question about selfishly, and I will say before anybody goes, make sure to join us next week and the week after with Nicole, and then we have John Navin, who wrote The Grim Years, that one of the books that John pointed out is that Lord Ashley Cusot document that's so interesting from 1675. I had always heard that it was signed by women. Is that true? Do you
I,
know?
I don't know. That's
I
interesting.
don't know where that came from.
I
But
bet
it's
Andrew Aga or Nicole may know the answer to that.
probably
John probably does as well.
probably. Well, it's interesting. I thought, ooh, that's an interesting sort of, if there's a matrilineal component of that, that would be really neat to know
There very well could be.
So, oh yes, Nicole
Nicole
said,
said yes. Look at
yes,
that.
how cool. So that would be that's really interesting for anybody who's interested in the intersection between women's history and Indigenous studies. That would be a really cool thing to kind of chase down and maybe learn more about. Gloria Bailey was asking about languages of the Westo Santee folks. If we know anything about those.
I mean, I can only tell you what I've read, and so if the Westo are indeed a northeastern tribe who migrated south, they likely spoke an Algonquian dialect. Um, and then the Santee, I mean, the Santee maybe Siouan, just because of its location and sort of nearness to what eventually becomes the Catawba Nation. But that's all speculation.
Yeah, there's so much that we don't know, but I feel like we're really making a lot of headway. And as John points out, I think today your attendance here shows that there's a great amount of interest in the topic, and we'll keep pushing forward and get more about it. But everybody, thanks so much for coming, and sign up for our next two. I think we've already been amassing some great information. I learned so much every week, so I appreciate it. So we'll sign off for today, and thank you, John, as always.
Thanks, y'all.
All right, bye guys.